Yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah. No, we insist. Yeah. Is it on all the time? Or? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This is obviously, it's a rather hot room, and this is obviously partly because this is obviously a hot ticket. Perhaps we should have charged for tickets, or perhaps we should have had a bigger room. So make yourself as comfortable as you can, and try not to be too warm. The aircon isn't working very well. Very warm welcome to this debate, though. My name is Charlie Beckett. I used to be a journalist with the BBC and Channel 4 News, and I now run a journalism think tank called Polis at the London School of Economics. And we have been very excited in London recently about a fantastic sort of media story that has been putting journalism absolutely in the spotlight, which in Britain is quite unusual. Normally we journalists like to try and keep in the shadows and get on with our work, but for journalists in Britain we have become the story. And indeed this week, for those of you who have been able to follow it, this week has been perhaps the most dramatic week in this whole story, when we've seen one of the most powerful media magnates, Rupert Murdoch, being grilled by lawyers in London. And of course this isn't the first time that he's been before an inquiry. Only a few months ago he was being questioned by MPs, and that particular session ended rather strangely with him being attacked by a man with a custard pie. But this week it's also got very, very political, that there have been calls for the resignation of the minister who's in charge of the media. So, you know, what has created all this incredible fuss? It's this story which we keep calling phone hacking. And that's what we are going to try and discuss. I can't honestly pretend that I can explain it in 2 minutes for you, so because it is such a complicated story. The ingredients involve the royal family, they involve various British public schoolboys, they involve 2 jailed journalists, it involves an Australian family dynasty, it involves, of course, the finest police force in the world, Scotland Yard, involves a former footballer, a murdered school child, an English comic film actor, a retired police horse, that's one of the crucial characters, and more seriously, a prime minister. This story, this phone hacking story, has had serious consequences for News Corporation. It's postponed what would have been the biggest merger in British journalism history, even though that merger was approved by the European Commission, and it's also resulted in the closure of Britain's most popular newspaper, which was, of course, the News of the World. And depending on, you know, which side, if you like, you might take in this story, this story could bring down Rupert Murdoch and his empire. It could even, some say, bring down the British government. We've got 3 people who are going to offer their perspective on this story. On my right is David Aranovich, who is a journalist who has worked at the BBC, but most recently he's a columnist at the Times newspaper. And you may be aware that the Times newspaper is, of course, owned by News International and Rupert Murdoch. And on my left, Amelia Hill, who worked formerly at the Observer, wasn't it, now at the Guardian newspaper. And Amelia has been one of the team of journalists at The Guardian who have been absolutely at the forefront of exploring this complicated story and bringing it to a much wider audience. And we also have Claudia Giua from L'Espresso. Now, obviously, not implicated in phone hacking, a journalist of great experience who now has a strategic role there, but can give us both the view from somebody who's been in the newsroom as a journalist, who understands the ethics of journalism organisations, but of course, crucially, can translate this whole drama, if you like, into an Italian perspective. As I say, I'm not going to try and explain the whole complicated story. Emilia is going to explain it in the sense that how she covered it, but just so you've got the very basics. The idea of phone hacking is it's not a secret, it's not difficult, you can all do it. It's very, very simple. All you do is ring somebody's mobile phone. If they don't answer and it goes to voicemail, you can then put in the key code, and most people don't change their key code, and so you can put in 000 or 9999, and you can access their voicemails. And this story then, this technique was then joined by various other techniques where journalists were blagging to get information. They were pretending to be somebody so they could obtain secret records of people from people's personal lives. And what has emerged through Emilia's work and other people's work is that the police service were allegedly involved in this and were taking money to help supply this information and had failed to investigate the original criminal case properly when indeed 2 journalists were taken to jail. But that's enough for now. Suffice to say that a top judge is investigating not just the phone hacking, not just the police, but the whole relationship between the British press and the British media more generally and politics. So it's the most thorough investigation ever, I think, really, of modern British media and its role in public life. And I'm going to turn first to Emilia to explain how she investigated this, but also why does this matter? How far does it go?
Well, in terms of how far the abuses went, it's quite interesting to go back and look at how far it was claimed to have gone. Back in 2005, when my colleague Nick Davis, who did this on his own, he was threatened, he was rubbished, and he ploughed on for many years. 2005, the News of the World admitted what became known as the rotten apple defence. They said that there was just 1 rogue journalist and 8 victims. And now, as Charlie said, it's just a story that keeps giving. I mean, we now have up to 3,000 mobile phones that were hacked. We had almost 900 victims who have been identified. Phone hacking at the News of the World was so endemic. We've got journalists who used to work there who say that it was actively encouraged, that even the office cat knew it was going on. It was also being used at other newspapers to the extent whereby it was common practice to ring, once you'd hacked into someone's phone and listened to their voicemail, you would then delete that voicemail so that you knew the next journalist from another paper ringing up couldn't then get that message. I mean, it was being done, I don't want to overstate it, it's a small proportion of journalists who are behaving this way, but it was a significant proportion. As Charlie said, there were cabinet ministers who were hacked, there were MPs, actors, sports stars, but there are also just ordinary people who are caught up in the limelight, often for extremely tragic reasons, such as the Millie Dowler story, which is where I really came into the picture, the murdered schoolgirl whose phone was hacked. And that really catalysed an absolute sort of revulsion in the public eye. It suddenly became something that wasn't just something journalists did to politicians and actors. It was something that really touched people at their most vulnerable and desperate. And it spread out. There were private investigators we discovered using other methods, as Charlie said, blagging. They were unlawfully accessing private and confidential information. They were accessing people's tax records, their itemised phone bills, their social security records. And the result of it is far from, News International spent years pushing it under the carpet, this one rogue reporter, this rotten exception. Now we've had acute pain and serious senior resignations at Scotland Yard, in Murdoch ranks in London and in New York, and closure of the Press Complaints Commission. And what my colleague Nick Davis has called the volatile chain reaction of this strange affair. Just a few days ago now, there's a slew of new emails released in Leveson that show that the influence of News Corporation reached deep into the heart of government, with a Secretary of State, Jeremy Hunt, seeming to have improperly and secretly colluded with News Corporation to push through the biggest deal that Murdoch had ever brokered, an £8 billion takeover of B-Sky B. Biggest history in Murdoch's News Corporation history, and one that only failed in the wake of the Millie Dowler story. I mean, they were days before that was to be finalised. And it could go even further. It could well be that, well, the questions now need to be asked about whether the influence was pushed further into government, right up to Cameron, whether these were favours that were being given, you know, the Sun monstered Gordon Brown, the new incoming Conservative government then pushed through the B-Sky B deal, emasculated the media regulator Ofcom, and imposed heavy cuts on the BBC. And if that's shown to be if we can prove or find evidence that that was done in collusion with News Corporation, then you know, you have a media ownership, Murdoch, who was more powerful than the state. So who's responsible? Well, Clive Goodman, the one rotten apple at the time, claimed that it was the pressures of the newsroom that were responsible, that the emphasis to get stories, the demands, and that normalised it. And there's signs, you know, it was normalised. They were hacking each other in the news of the world. They were hacking people that they could virtually easily just have phoned and spoken to. And they're still arguing about how far up the chain of command it was known about at the time. Andy Colston, the editor, resigned, saying it happened on his watch, but Gov, he knew nothing about it. But what's more interesting is the complex web of responsibility, whereby people who should have challenged it colluded, and they colluded from fear and from ambition. My colleague Nick Davis has talked about the toxic nexus, and this is what Murdoch does. He takes a newspaper and he takes a television station, and he uses those to get influence on the politicians. And once he's got those corners of the triangle, he generates enormous power. And that power, in turn, generates fear and dominance and immunity. And News International became untouchable. It owned 40% of the newspapers, and Sky, which is, you know, has been called an £800 gorilla. And politicians have admitted that they courted News International, that they felt they had no alternative. Well, you can say they had no alternative. You can also say that they were weak and they sucked up to him. In Monday's Guardian, Michael Wolff, who's Murdoch's biographer, said it was Murdoch's job to try and influence, frighten and control the politicians, and it was theirs to stand up to him. There was this unspoken, at best there was an unspoken reciprocity between News International and the politicians. At Leveson yesterday, Murdoch said that he had no direct deals with Blair, perish the thought, and then admitted that he saw him 3 times a year on average, as though that's something that every voter gets a right to do. And he also said that he admitted Blair had actually gone that extra mile for me in terms of the EU referendum. And Blair also imposed heavy anti-union laws, which again, something that Murdoch was clearly for. But there's also a more sinister side to what's known as monstering. As I've touched on, News International had a powerful intelligence operation. We've seen it in the committee that's been looking at this. Private investigators have put MPs under surveillance. They've put lawyers who are asking questions under surveillance. And even before that, you know, they thought absolutely nothing of blackmailing people, that they would gather information on people, secret, confidential information, and blackmail them into talking to them. Otherwise, they would publish this information that was even more personal and even more damaging. News International not only had this intelligence operation, they had the means to publish the dirt. You know, they had the newspapers, they had Sky, and they also had a formidable legal department that would defend and browbeat anyone who tried to complain what was happening to them. And this is why the media needs particular rules governing itself, guaranteeing plurality, guaranteeing a level playing field for competition. And just a final point, that we do need to put this in context. Most journalists have no idea how to hack a phone, and they have no interest. They don't go to work in order to dig into other people's sex lives. And whilst heinous journalism practices have been uncovered, they weren't uncovered by the police, they weren't uncovered by the politicians, they were uncovered by journalists using good old-fashioned techniques. And that is something to celebrate and to be proud of.
Great. Thanks very much, Amelia. At some point in this debate, we're going to talk about, after, if it's possible, after phone hacking. Does it mean that we need a whole new sort of regulatory system, whether there's a problem more systematically? But before we do, let's keep talking about this specific set of controversies. And David, if you'd like to respond to what Amelia's been saying.
Do you mind if I don't respond?
Well, don't respond directly, no.
But say what I want to say anyway,
Yeah.
Otherwise we really would be here all night.
Yeah.
For me, part of the problem with thinking about coming here and being part of this panel today was which aspect of the phone hacking scandal was it that I was supposed to talk about? My far distant boss giving evidence over the last 2 days at this judicial inquiry, the Leveson inquiry, which is a fairly unprecedented quasi-judicial process and so on. He has been asked questions which actually have nothing to do with phone hacking whatsoever, have nothing to do with the issue of whether or not it was a widespread practice for phones to be hacked by journalists, or whether or not management colluded in such a practice. He's been asked questions about his relationship with Mrs. Thatcher in 1975. He's been asked questions about his relationship with Tony Blair. He's been asked today about what he thinks about the Daily Mail's online website, which is currently the most successful free newspaper-based website, although actually it now increasingly has nothing whatsoever to do with the newspaper, and that's an issue we'll come back to hopefully in a moment and so on. In other words, we could be talking about any of these things arising out of phone hacking. When Amelia was at work on her original story, I don't think she could conceivably have imagined that one of the consequences of it might be that she herself would be facing the possibility of being put in prison. I don't think she will be, and I sincerely hope that she won't be. But there have been what we call a lot of perverse consequences out of this process. And I'll try and take you very briefly through what some of them seem to me to mean. And it's my own individual take on it. It's not anything that you would necessarily find anybody would agree with me about. The first is that this is not the first major scandal or issue of accountability to hit Britain, or indeed any other country, in the course of the last 5 to 10 years. It now looks as if what we've got is the press facing the same kind of pressure to talk about itself and to come clean about its practices that have already happened in other major political and social institutions over the course of the last decade. It's only 2 years ago since we in Britain had a major crisis over what we called MPs' expenses, how much MPs were allowed to claim in expenses. I have a feeling that by Italian standards, this was a very small scandal indeed. And actually, by Italian standards, most of our scandals are very small indeed. When we talk about criminality in Britain, one of the things that's interesting is that the former editor of The Independent wrote yesterday about a claim that was made by Mr. James Murdoch when he had marched into his office at The Independent a few years back, and with Rebecca Brooks, who was the chief executive of News International, and she had effectively said, it's very, very wrong of you to be speaking about us in the way you have, after you've been attending all those parties and so on. Mr. Kellner described this as being the actions of the mafiosi. And I thought, well, here in Italy, in this kind of context, you may not see it in quite the same light, since nobody was threatened with anything. And actually, Simon Kellner has suffered no consequences. He hasn't been taken into a fishing boat and dropped into the Solent, that's the bit between Britain and the Isle of Wight, with concrete slippers. That hasn't happened to him. But exaggeration is a major part of what's going on. So we've had this crises, these crises of accountability and transparency. And each has seen a kind of progression towards the opening up of institutions that were previously closed or had their own magic. It's been an inexorable process. Some people would argue it's been happening for over 50 years throughout the West, and these are its particular manifestations in Britain. The second thing that it is a crisis of is it's a crisis of ethics. Now, the reason why I say it's a crisis of journalistic ethics and about journalistic ethics and not legality is that the very thing that has been investigated by Amelia and her colleagues is an action that was not illegal in Britain until the year 2000. It was made illegal by a specific act of Parliament that was actually trying to do something completely different. It was a complete byproduct of that particular act. It was made illegal then. So one of the questions journalists have to ask themselves is, it was not legal before it was legal before the year 2000, but was it ethical? Was it ever ethical to behave in such a way? What are the ethics of investigative journalism? And by the way, I think far too much attention is paid to investigative as opposed to analytical journalism, and has been ever since Watergate. It's been one of the kind of great things. Everybody wants to be an investigative journalist and find out the kind of secret thing, when actually what you have around you is a society that requires you to look at it carefully and analyse it quite often and give the information out. People are very often not interested in information, they're interested in stories. Journalists typically are interested in stories, and that's part of the difficulty we face. However, it's a crisis of ethics. But, and Amelia identified this moment, this only became a crisis of ethics when a very particular type of victim was discovered. This was a murder victim, somebody who'd already been killed by the time her mobile phone was hacked into, incidentally. She was already dead. At this point, the public joined the disgust. But the public was not disgusted about the use of hacking to go into the telephones of celebrities. Because, by and large, the public, and I include young people in this, regard celebrities as being fair game for having their privacy invaded. And this leads us to another very major problem, which we're going to see increasingly, which is the part of the media that Charlie came from, that Amelia comes from, and that I come from, what we call in Britain the broadsheet journalism, the serious journalism, is subsidised journalism. It is essentially paid for by other people. It's essentially paid for on the same basis as opera is paid for, and is frequented by very much the same sort of people, maybe a slightly wider selection of people, and so on. It's opera journalism. The majority of people in Britain are not tuning into the Leveson inquiry at the moment. They don't care about it very much. They've got the point about it insofar as anything has happened. The rest of it is left for the rest of us to try and sort out. Last night, the BBC current affairs programme, Panorama, had one of its biggest audiences for many years. Why? Had it done a programme about the origins of the economic crisis? No. No, it hadn't. Had it done a programme about Charles Taylor appearing before the International Criminal Court in The Hague and being sentenced as he was today? And indeed, was Twitter, my Twitter timeline, alive with people talking about that? No, it wasn't. It was talking about the Madeleine McCann case 5 years after she disappeared. Had it anything new to say about it? No. Did millions of people tune in because they were interested in that? Yeah. And this is a kind of continuing and ongoing problem, which is that serious journalism is subsidised journalism, and it has, except for the BBC and other places, been subsidised by tabloid journalism. And tabloid journalism is the sort of journalism whose ethics are now under threat and whose processes are now correctly threatened. And we haven't worked our way through that. And my final point is this. This also comes at a moment, and I don't think it's accidental. I don't mean by that it's a conspiracy. I mean it's not accidental in this sense. It comes at a moment when newspapers and broadcast journalism are trying to deal with the financial and economic consequences of the internet. No one has found a way of making serious journalism pay. No one. We haven't found a way of what they call monetizing serious journalism at all. There is an entire generation, I see a lot of you in this room, who now expect journalists effectively to work for free. You're going to pick it up free, it must be free. You don't expect to go into the Apple store and pick up your computer free, but you do expect to get the reports from journalists free, although many of you would like to be journalists and you don't want to work for free, and so on. We haven't solved this problem. The Mail Online, the most successful online is essentially a retread of lots of other stuff that other journalists are working on, as Rupert Murdoch himself said today, and it never, ever veers away from the populist, the celebrity-obsessed, and the sexually obsessed, and so on. And so this remains a huge problem for us. If the subsidised basis of tabloid journalism is hit any further, then the question about who funds serious broadsheet journalism becomes very important to us. Now, I'm going to say this coming from the Times. The Times may be owned by Rupert Murdoch, but, for instance, the Times foreign journalism is the best in Britain. I think it's probably even better than the BBC's. That's paid for by Murdoch as well, and to a significant extent has been cross-subsidised out of tabloid journalism, which is popular with the press. The Guardian, which Amelia works for, has found no satisfactory way so far to deal with this problem. And we are facing the situation in 20 years' time, as Rupert Murdoch said, when we may have no newspapers in the active sense at all. And the question of how we fund online journalism becomes very important. And if we're not going to do it with a mixture of sensationalism and sex, etc., then a big question is, how are we going to do it?
Exactly. Just a quick follow-up question, David. I understand you characterise the problem, the crisis of ethics and the internet and the business model, and you're saying quite clearly that, and indeed it's true, that Rupert Murdoch has invested hundreds of millions in terms of Sky News, The Times, etc. But do you think, putting that to one side if you can, do you agree or not that there is a serious problem, and this is probably how Amelia's editor Alan Rusbridger would characterise it, that there is a separate, distinct issue around News Corporation, or rather News International, and Rupert Murdoch?
To an extent I do. I do think that there has been. I never understood why it was that politicians misunderstood the transmission mechanism whereby decisions were taken in the media. It was always the case that newspaper editors and newspaper owners wanted to sell newspapers. So in a significant extent, what they do is they reflect the reader's interest back to them, whilst at the same time partly shaping them. Politicians have seemed to me to have an extraordinary kind of attitude towards this, which is that somehow or other newspaper proprietors or broadcasters could create entire waves of popular feeling somehow out of the ether, and I've just never ever believed it. But one of the things that's happened in Britain is that we've always had, a sort of strange relationship with the politicians. In the Second World War and the First World War, media tycoons were actually in the British cabinet at that time. They actually served as quasi-party politicians at that time, and they probably exercised more power at that time than Rupert Murdoch has ever exercised since.
Do you think...
However, and I'm going to come back to this point, what is ironic is that Murdoch's greater ownership of B-Sky B, and after all, he created Sky Television, in the teeth of immense opposition, at the time, almost certainly would have had no impact upon that particular thing. And the reason why, and Amelia didn't say it, and she's never, and people aren't called upon to say it, but the reason why, for instance, people like The Guardian and the Daily Mail opposed that ownership was not actually anything to do with increased political influence for Rupert Murdoch. It was for commercial reasons, because what it would mean was that the Murdoch, News International and News Corporation could bundle up subscriptions for the newspapers along with the television, and that would give them significant competitive advantage in terms actually of selling newspapers or selling online material. And that was the reason they opposed it. One of the things that doesn't happen in this process is that nobody's asking the last Labour government or Vince Cable, who was a previous and Liberal Democrat business secretary, in fact he is business secretary at the moment, whether or not they had had contacts with those opposing the B-Sky B deal and to show them. If they did, I think it would be quite interesting. And maybe Amelia will go on to that next, I don't know.
Do you want to come in there before I come to Claudia? Do you want to come in, Amelia, at all? I'm not trying to characterise it as an argument here, but was there anything you want to pick up on?
I think the issue about saying that we didn't talk about the plurality issue, David, is unfair and perhaps slightly inaccurate. I think we've always been very clear that one of the reasons we were extremely concerned about the B-Sky B bid was the complete disparity in terms of competitive advantage it would give and the damage it would do in terms of the influence that they could wield as well. I'm also not sure about what you say when you talk, that you're quite right when you talk about the papers having greater power in the past because the editors were part of the political elite. Proprietors. We've always been very clear in the UK that we have our papers are biased. They do come from a political standpoint. It's not like America. We have Ofcom that keep our broadcast media balanced, but it's a power that Murdoch had to monster. It's a power he had to stride into Kellner's office. It's a power he had to blackmail and threaten. That's why he did have more power than in the past. Okay, let's pause there. Claudia, would you like to respond to that and give us your perspective from what you've heard and obviously what you know about it?
Speak in Italian, so
yes, of course, sorry.
Io credo che intanto il quadro che ci hanno dato Amelia e David è molto completo. Ci raccontano una storia che in Italia bene o male non abbiamo conosciuto così bene. I giornali l'hanno trattata in Italia non molto profondamente. Oggi alcuni giornali hanno fatto un resoconto abbastanza ampio. Repubblica ha fatto un paio di pagine sulle dichiarazioni di ieri di Rupert Murdoch davanti alla commissione Leveson, ma direi che in generale la vicenda è stata seguita più per i suoi aspetti spettacolari che per la sua profonda importanza per il giornalismo. Mi riferisco in particolare a quando sembrò che dovevano arrestare Rebecca, Brooks, Wade e poi invece non fu arrestata, e poi l'arresto successivo che allora si fecero grandi titoli. Parlo appunto di oggi, del titolo di oggi sulla deposizione di ieri di Murdoch, ma per il resto non ce ne siamo occupati molto. Eppure Murdoch è un editore importante anche in Italia, è un grande editore, anzi uno degli editori italiani più importanti, Rupert Murdoch, perché come tutti sappiamo possiede la televisione satellitare monopolista in Italia. Dobbiamo dire onestamente che il giornalismo che Rupert Murdoch ha sviluppato in Italia attraverso Sky News è un buon giornalismo. No? Tant'è che molto spesso alcune delle cose, delle campagne anche che ha fatto Sky News in Italia, Sky News 24 in Italia sono state interessanti. Non so, mi riferisco per esempio a quella per portare i leader politici a confronto, i faccia a faccia dei leader politici in Italia, cosa che non ha ottenuto ma che è stata certamente di rilievo. E Rupert Murdoch inoltre sarebbe considerato, secondo i criteri italiani, quello che noi chiamiamo un editore puro, cioè un editore che non ha degli interessi specifici al di fuori dell'editoria, che è quello che viene rimproverato da molti anni, giustamente secondo me, alla gran parte o a quasi ormai tutti gli editori italiani che hanno interessi in altri settori. Quindi, come dire, visto dalla nostra prospettiva, l'esperienza italiana di Murdoch e la figura anche dello stesso Murdoch è una figura non negativa per quello che ha fatto in Italia. Lo stesso adesso capo dei giornali del gruppo Murdoch in Gran Bretagna, Tom Mockridge, che è stato per molti anni, che è un giornalista di formazione ed è stato per molti anni il capo di Sky in Italia. E credo che stia facendo un buon lavoro adesso in Gran Bretagna. Ecco, tutto questo per dire che valutare Murdoch nella sua complessità è un'impresa molto complessa, perché Murdoch è qualcosa quando si parla dei tabloid, e la storia che stiamo analizzando lo dice chiaramente, è un'altra cosa quando si parla del Times, è un'altra cosa ancora quando si parla del Wall Street Journal che ha acquistato pochi anni fa, quando tenta di entrare pesantemente fallendo nel mondo del web e fallisce e se ne va, con le sue televisioni. Fox News, Fox negli Stati Uniti è una delle espressioni di informazione televisiva peggiore della storia della televisione al mondo, direi, senza alcun dubbio. Eppure in Italia, abbiamo detto, fa del buon giornalismo. È un insieme di contraddizioni che sono difficili da rappresentare e ridurre a un unicum. E questo è un po' il quadro a cui ci riferiamo. Per riportarlo invece alla nostra realtà italiana, è esistito mai qualcosa del genere in Italia? No, questo tipo di azioni, di intrusione pesante nella vita delle persone, e non solo, come spiegava bene David, dei VIP o delle persone importanti, note dello spettacolo, del calcio, del cinema, della televisione e quant'altro, ma soprattutto l'intrusione pesantissima, ho capito male, 3.000 persone normali o persone che avevano come l'unica loro colpa quella di essere state coinvolti in vicende anche terribili come dei rapimenti di familiari, eccetera. Ecco, tutto questo è qualcosa che in Italia non abbiamo vissuto, e tuttavia mi è capitato recentemente di sentire a chiacchiere tra giornalisti una sorta di soddisfazione di vedere il giornalismo inglese, che per moltissimi anni in Italia abbiamo considerato una specie di faro, che sia finito in queste condizioni. Non c'è tanto da essere soddisfatti, perché il fatto che oggi ci siano queste difficoltà dimostrano in ogni caso che il giornalismo inglese, britannico, ha delle capacità di rinnovarsi, stanno tentando di rinnovarsi, mentre invece il giornalismo italiano in qualche modo da molti anni sta perdendo pezzi, no? Mi riferisco in particolare proprio al giornalismo investigativo di cui qui si tratta, cioè dov'è il giornalismo investigativo in Italia oggi? Che fine ha fatto? E soprattutto che risorse ci sono oggi per fare del vero giornalismo investigativo in Italia? I pochi che tentano di farlo, mi riferisco a Report piuttosto che all'Espresso o qualche altro rarissimo esempio in Italia, hanno delle difficoltà o politiche o economiche a portarlo avanti. È molto difficile. Se oggi guardiamo i giornali italiani troviamo che i giornali italiani sono fatti, soprattutto quelli non di prima fascia, non il Corriere, la Stampa, Repubblica, ma se andiamo nei giornali regionali o locali, ho fatto recentemente una prova per fare un controllo sul campo, sono fatti ormai quasi esclusivamente di comunicati e di agenzie. Non c'è più un giornalismo di scavo, di andare a capire le cose come vanno. E questo è un dramma che in qualche modo è forse, se non pari, è peggiore di quello che stanno vivendo in Gran Bretagna. Quindi non c'è tanto da essere, da essere contenti da questa comparazione con il giornalismo britannico. Io credo che il rinnovamento possa avvenire solo e questo in qualche modo l'ha detto anche David, possa avvenire solo dalla possibilità di trovare nuove fonti di finanziamento legittime per un giornalismo investigativo, da una parte, perché bisogna rendersi conto che l'informazione di qualità, l'informazione investigativa non può non essere pagata, deve essere pagata qualsiasi sia la piattaforma su cui viaggia, perché se non viene pagata nessuno la farà, nessuno avrà la possibilità di farlo. Chi di voi, vedo tra voi moltissimi ragazzi giovani, vorrà fare il giornalista, deve rendersi conto che oggi fare il giornalista significa andare per la gran parte del tempo a passare agenzie e occuparsi di comunicati che arrivano da enti, istituzioni, dalla polizia, dai carabinieri, dal comune, dalla provincia, eccetera. Non è certamente andare a fare lavoro di scavo, e questo perché non c'è la possibilità di avere delle remunerazioni che consentano di mantenere anche quel tipo di giornalismo che invece secondo me è uno dei punti fermi anche soprattutto della democrazia. Quindi credo così, insomma, che da questa lezione britannica possono venire insegnamenti utili per tutti, anche per noi. L'esagerazione da una parte o dall'altra, cioè nel mitizzare il giornalismo degli altri da una parte, o poi come è successo adesso, trovarsi a dover guardare a questo giornalismo con una sorta di stupore, perché mai ti saresti aspettato questo al giornalismo inglese, è un errore, perché probabilmente bisogna semplicemente continuare a lavorare puntando alla qualità e trovando per l'informazione delle fonti di ricavi che consentono all'informazione di vivere in una realtà molto 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 competitiva, sempre più competitiva.
Great. Thank you very much. That's a fascinating response, and it also takes us forward as well, which is very helpful. In a second I'm going to come to you because I think you might have lots of questions to ask. But I just want to very briefly go back to the two British journalists on the panel, just to think that word renewal. What happens next is not a solution. You're sort of suggesting, David, that the Lord Leveson process, with its suggestion for new regulatory authorities and things like that, in a sense, might be a bit of a sideshow.
Sometimes during this entire business, I've got the impression that some people would be happier, and I've certainly got the impression, Amelia, of this about some of my colleagues in The Guardian, if Rupert Murdoch were to withdraw from newspapers in Britain altogether. Okay. That, of course, and this kind of really illustrates the problem that we have. What Murdoch said is, I'm a newspaper guy. I love newspapers. You're more likely to find what I stand for in the tabloid newspaper that I run, but I'm proud of my newspapers. And he then said, but my shareholders aren't sure I should be, or something to that effect. In other words, there's an enormous amount of pressure from within News International, News Corporation, to concentrate on the money-making parts of the business, and those parts of the business that are not problematic, and dump the journalistic and newspaper parts of the business. And I think it's one of the perverse consequences of this process would be if that were to happen, because nobody's told me who picks up the money and pays for the important titles like the Times if that's to happen. I mean, Amelia, would it be better if the Emir of Qatar owned the Times? I mean, you've got to have an answer to this kind of question. That's what we have in football at the moment. Every football fan resents the fact that Manchester City is given £1 zillion by the Qataris, and every football fan hopes that it happens to them.
Okay. That's our breaking news, that Roman Abramovich has been apparently in talks over ownership of The Guardian. No, kidding.
Again,
For a minute your hopes were raised there, weren't they?
I don't think you do have to have an answer before you can ask a question, David. And I think how to make newspapers pay links into neatly why this happened in the UK. Because, yes, you can make newspapers pay by doing quality journalism, long-form journalism. Journalism means people have to pick up the paper and read it or pay to log on, rather than just read someone else's blog. But the money-making, what Britain has that other countries don't, is the money-making potential of getting the only picture of David Beckham's new daughter, or the first picture of the royal family's new child, or whatever. That potential across Europe, across the world, is vast, and that's why the atmosphere in the UK is so much more intense than in other countries, because that is how we do make our newspapers pay, largely. You talked about the trade-off between the tabloids and the broadsheets, and that's how the tabloids make money.
But is there we do indeed have perhaps the most competitive newspaper press. Do you have any expectation that Leveson, etc., this whole process will somehow you know, clean that up?
I think that two things. It is slightly unfortunate that Leveson is now looking at new regulations for the press at almost precisely the point where it becomes completely irrelevant, because going online, it's all online now. On the other hand, what we want from Leveson is we have to agree, the press, on a definition of public interest, and we have to have you know, a definition that the broadsheets can agree on and the tabloids can agree on, because that is how you rebuild confidence. That is how you justify why the media should still exist, why people should continue reading it. At the moment in the UK, a lot of laws have no public interest defence, so we have to find a way of balancing Article 8, the right to privacy, with Article 10, the freedom of expression, undercutting it with public interest. That's how we clean it up.
I just want to come back, because formally that might be right. In practice, it's not going to work in the way that you want it to. The public's definition of public interest is not the same as yours and mine. It isn't. It just is not. If it was, then they wouldn't read and look at the things they do that you and I don't look at and read. And this, I've been trying with this question of how we balance up the various European articles, the one to privacy and the one to information. And meanwhile, whilst we debate these issues, the way in which social life has gone on, the way in which new generations interpret these things has marched straight past the law and into an entirely new uncharted area, well beyond our capacity to define in some kind of legal way. And this is presenting us now with all kinds of problems that are much, much bigger. Let me just give you one example very quickly. I'm sorry to kind of and then I'll shut up. On Twitter in England this week, a rape case victim was named widely on Twitter. Okay? This is strictly illegal in British law. No newspaper would have done it or even considered doing it or even hinted at doing it. It's what we call 101 in journalistic law. Twitter doesn't know journalistic law and so on. So what are you now going to do? Are we now going to prosecute Twitter for having allowed this to go out on it? Well, cue the great growls of outrage if anything like that happens. Are we going to find and prosecute every single person who did it or retweeted it because they were all guilty of an offence? Tremendously difficult. We can have whatever law we like for the media, but and that goes back to the point that you correctly made earlier, Amelia, but actually the world has moved past us.
I have to say, I think the public defence of public interest isn't relevant. We're not talking censorship here. We're talking about regulation of the media. And Twitter naming that rape victim isn't journalism. And you're confusing too many different areas here. If you pile too many questions in, you're muddying the waters, and you're just going to create a sense of exhaustion. We have to keep... We're talking about the media, and that's different from everything you've just talked about. It's different to journalism. Twitter is not journalism.
Yeah. No, it's not.
So we don't. So it's a different question.
And a lot of the open journalism the Guardian's talking about, in my terms, isn't journalism either.
Okay. Now we're sliding into another.
It's all out there.
But not irrelevant. We can keep these points coming back. So let's just take some questions. But by all means, introduce these points as we do it. So first, gentleman over there. Do we have a microphone at all? Per favore. No. Just.
Let's just shout so that the.
Yeah. Here we go.
Sorry.
Grazie.
I just want to take something up, because, David, you sounded a bit there saying, well, don't blame the quality of the newspapers because that's what the public wants. I don't know if I followed that, but anyway, that can only happen when a media entity is extremely strong and is widespread and powerful. And you have to look at the ways in which News International has come that far. And you said that the Leveson inquiry was moving away from phone hacking, and Rupert was getting all sorts of questions about his involvement with Thatcher. If you look at what was actually revealed pretty much yesterday, was that a meeting that was always denied before, Murdoch met with Thatcher 3 weeks before he put in a bid to buy the Times. So basically sealing the deal for his whole media ownership. And it was going to be referred to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, because he already owned a significant amount of media interest in the UK. After that meeting, it was magically bypassed. Now, we don't know what was talked about at that meeting, but I'm assuming it wasn't the weather. And if that's allowed to happen, if these practices go on without being investigated with no repercussions, then I don't think people should be surprised when a large media organization hacks the phones of murdered schoolgirls.
Well, I have to say, I mean, this sounds like a kind of really bad thing, but this feels like absolutely ancient history to me now. I've had people tweeting me going back to it. For Italian listeners, you have to understand that for a large number of people in Britain, the Thatcher period was very traumatic. The centre-left and the left of the spectrum, on which I am, did not expect Mrs. Thatcher to win the 1979 election, and the trauma of her period in government has never quite left us. But it's left everybody else, just about. I mean, in other words, this is not Mrs. Thatcher will not be giving evidence at the Leveson inquiry for fairly obvious reasons, and so on. And all I can say is, I have no idea. I mean, I would be very surprised if there weren't discussions at that time which were subsequently denied. I don't think it would surprise anybody. But if the picture you're trying to draw essentially is this, that Rupert Murdoch, which is what some of my friends believe, by his use of media power and accruing of media power, used it in order both to hugely advance his own economic position very deliberately, and also to influence the British political outcome in any major way very deliberately, I think that's too crude an analysis. I do. I think that's far too, and I think it's a misreading of the last 30 years of British history, most of which would have unfolded exactly as it has if Rupert Murdoch had never been born.
Okay. Let's take another question, anybody? No other questions at all? Yes, please, in the middle.
Hi, my name is Magnus Sherman. I'm from Denmark. I would like to know to what extent you think this case is driven by the act, which is the hacking of the phones, or the personalities. Would this have been the same case if it was like a non-profit journal, a non-profit newspaper hacking Mr. Murdoch?
If it had been a non-profit newspaper...
Hacking the phone of Mr. Murdoch.
Right, okay. Yeah.
This one for you.
Of a minister. What it's saying in a sense, and this is quite an important point, if you think about the MP's expenses story, that was obtained illegally. And in the past, other Guardian journalists have said, they have done investigative journalism where they've broken the law.
Well, they've blacked, yeah.
David Lee and so on. Do you think what drives this story is a political story about power in the media and Murdoch, and what has been, as you say, incredible characters, and indeed the Millie Dowler story that propelled it into the public consciousness, or is there something more general here?
I think things that have been. It's a good question, and I think that Murdoch's character and the power he wielded over Britain over decades is one of the reasons why it's so fascinating. But the level of power is what is really fascinating. Following the money, following that thread, the tentacles now might reach to the Prime Minister. We don't know. They certainly lead to a senior politician who had hopes to be a Conservative leader one day. So I think it's the icing on top that it's Murdoch. The story itself is extraordinary enough to keep rapt attention.
So it's
how much of it... Sorry, yours. So go on.
Yeah. Is it on? Okay. So it's just fulfilling a desire to criticize the rich and the powerful, or is it is it really criticizing phone hacking? If it was Mr. Murdoch being hacked by a non-profit newspaper and not a normal dead girl being hacked by a very rich man?
Well, when the story was first, we were writing about the story for a couple of years, and all we had then was the paper hacking into the phones of celebrities and politicians, and it didn't trigger this mass revulsion in the public. It was when we found it, the Millie Dowler link, that was what triggered it.
Yeah. Sorry, John.
I just want to make a question. Do you think that in the next future, I mean, after the stories it's ended, maybe in 5-10 years, the system of the newspapers in the UK are going to change a lot? I mean, do you think that the power and the aid of the tabloids is going to still so important like it is now, or not?
Well, I think the power of the tabloids in terms of wielding or blackmailing and manipulating politicians has the back doorway they were doing it, I hope, will have finished, because they won't have, you know, what I talked about, the powerful intelligence operation, digging up dirt, blackmailing them with publishing. I don't think they will be able to do that, but they, hopefully they'll have power in other ways, because they'll have a powerful readership who read what they write and respond to it in the ballots.
Yeah. I must say, Amelia, I look forward to volume 2 of this, because you have now used this word blackmail 5 times, and now used it in reference, to politicians being blackmailed. And this creates a very kind of particular impression about what's been going on in Britain. I'm not aware of any solid information that any politician has been blackmailed. I just don't know of it, and I can't quite see how, in a way, that the reason why politicians sucked up to Murdoch as they do to the Daily Mail, and the reason why the Guardian every year has a major party at the party political conferences and so on, though slightly down, and I've been at those too as well, is because the political classes like to try and influence what we as journalists do. Now, you know that.
You're charmingly naive, David. Huh? You're charmingly naive. I mean, what would you call it other with more? Let's start with normal people. Charlotte Church. They found out awful stuff about her mother and went to her and said, unless you give us a personal interview about something desperate, we will publish this even more desperate. No, and then they did that twice. And they've done it to politicians as well.
When? Which politician has been blackmailed into doing something they wouldn't otherwise do? In other words, they've said, if you don't do X that we want you to do, then we will do X, Y to you. Who's that happened to? I've not had a single actual solid case of it happening.
They have had sexual secrets of politicians that they've been...
Who?
Chris Bryant.
Chris Bryant has no sexual secrets.
Well, he doesn't anymore, because they put the photos all over the internet.
No, he posed on his own Facebook, on his own website.
No, he didn't.
In his
No, he didn't. That's not where those photos came from. You haven't done your research.
Simon Hughes?
Yeah, also Simon Hughes.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, though, it's not about... The accusation isn't that... well, it is partly the accusation that individuals may have been targeted, but it's also about the kind of weight of political influence and whether that distorts, the relationship between the politicians and the media. Yes, of course, politicians want attention, but if it's all done, with this, if one particular group is particularly aggressive and particularly successful, does that distort the process?
There is a particular problem. We all understand what it is. Politicians have no direct access to the electorate. If a politician, I don't know how it is in Italy, it may well be that if Mr. Monti comes down to Perugia and says, I wish to talk to you, that he'd pack out the local theatre and that you'd all come to see him in your thousands, okay? But presuming that Mr. Monti doesn't have quite that kind of sex appeal that, let's say, a major film star does, then in that case, everything that Mr. Monti does or says only comes through to you via some reporter or another. That's all. This may be changing very slightly. Mr. Monti has a very interesting Twitter feed. I don't know whether he does. It may be that he now directly communes with the young people of Italy and you can talk to him directly. I have no idea, but generally speaking. So what it is that politicians want is they want the media to tell the story they want to have it told, in the categories and in the narrative sense that they want it told, and they don't want the narrative that they don't want told going out. That's the way in which the media exercises power. That's why still politicians are more interested in taking me to lunch than I am in going to lunch with politicians. Okay.
Can I ask you to redress that? In Britain we have this strange thing where there's both a very aggressive approach by the press to politicians, and yet at the same time very cosy, as David says, always at lunch together, and has been revealed, not just at lunch, on yachts and on holidays and riding horses together and so on. What's the state of the relationship in Italy?
Well, you see that if you look at the Italian newspapers, you can see that the most important ones, you can see that there are pages and pages about politics on Italian newspapers. And so it means that, I don't know if the interest of our public is so huge, but we cover a lot of politics information, And the relationships between journalists and the power and the politics is very close. If you are talking about the national politics, very, very close. For example, if you go to the parliament, they live together, they eat together, they talk to the politicians every day, many times a day, and so on. So it's something that is very, very close. They don't need to ask something to newspapers. Newspapers are going to them, and they can, they can translate in the better way what they want. It's not so difficult for them, and so they can reach the newspapers in a very direct way. But the difference is that newspapers in Italy are about 5 million circulation per day, so it's very, very little one. So it's not so large like and we don't have something like the tabloids. We don't have tabloids at all. So it's something that they don't need, because if they go to our tabloids, I can say our tabloids are the TV's shows, porta. This is a very, 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 very important one. Every 3 nights per week, for 3 hours, maybe we talk about everything that very interesting for the politicians, and more than newspapers. So you have to go there to see if how many times they go to the talk show is the most important way to understand how powerful they are, and even which kind of relation they have with the journalists.
Yeah.
David says that we all agree on what the problem was, and we certainly don't, because I don't. But the power that you talk about isn't anything new. You're standing up for your boss, and I understand that. But this squabbling, we have to find a way to move on. Politicians have admitted that they got too close, and they've learned sharp lessons about that we'll hope will be lasting. There are signs that the media is finding a new positive role model. That the FT has opened a new investigative team. The Guardian is now putting its focus on doing long journalism in the paper, really ploughing into analytical, investigative journalism as well. That's the way to make papers pay, and I think that's what is going to come out of Leveson, a renewed focus on that sort of robust journalism.
Okay. I should just say before he does that I'm sure you weren't accusing. Yeah, no. Well, he's not standing up for his boss.
No, I'm not actually.
Okay. Yeah. But anyway,
and I haven't heard you criticise yours. So
yeah. Let's take a question from the floor, please. Oh, yeah. Do you just want to do the last bit again? Got the back. Go on.
What are the plans for cleaning up journalism and their relationship with the police? How many heads of the Met have to roll, or doesn't this matter? It's been utterly corrupt what's been going on there. As an ordinary citizen, is absolutely corrupt. And I think David, it's potentially sophistry to suggest that there has to be no blackmail. It seems that there's no evidence. But I, as a private citizen, when one of the major players in this saga says to me, "My friends are very angry with you," I was slightly shocked, thought, which friends could you possibly mean? But I did imagine at that time how a politician, a lowly MP, might feel when someone suggested to them that maybe somebody might be angry with them, and that may be anecdotal at this point, and I don't wish to go into the evidence thereof, but it happened to me. So hearsay to you, but it isn't hearsay from me.
Okay. Do you want to deal with the police bit especially? I mean, partly to explain how far do you think that there is a problem with, the police? Is it is it a journalist's ethical problems, or was it? Is there systematic corruption in the police, or was it just this one-off around the phone hacking that John Yates says they were too busy because of the London bombings?
I'm not sure that there's systematic corruption, but the police definitely got too close to News International. Yates had a personal friend of Rebecca Brooks. I'm actually very worried about what Leveson is now, the impact of Leveson on the relationship between the police and journalism. Now that we're being told that we can't talk to any policeman unless there's a press officer present, which is, if that's, and I'm still a suspect in a criminal investigation. I mean, I still could go to prison for the crime of, I'm accused of talking to a policeman. That's what I'm accused of, I'm not. That would be, if that's carried through, then all journalism is toast. And if that is a result of Leveson, then that is a sad day for journalism indeed.
And that sort of goes back to the politician theme, doesn't it, David? That in a sense, in the past, there was supposed to be what we called a rough trade, that politicians and journalists were allowed to talk in pubs, that politicians would take a hit sometimes and then they would kick back.
There's been a side of British journalism that I've never liked, which doesn't exist so much in American high-end journalism, which is doing things like taking anonymous sources and using anonymous sources. I was actually trained in most of my attitudes towards journalism in broadcasting, and particularly latterly in the BBC. And I felt when I came to newspapers, even in high-end newspapers, that their attitudes towards practices were actually very lax, and they were prepared to do things that the BBC wouldn't. Some of the contacts, for instance, between high-end journalists and police officers and so on would be pretty problematic in a BBC context. I don't know whether you agree, Richard. Richard Lindley used to work, who's in the front here, used to work for many years on Panorama and so on. And we were covered in the days I was at the BBC by an enormous set of guidelines about what you could, and Charlie too, could and couldn't do, which would make even a Guardian or high-end Times journalist roll their eyes with about how could you be so restricted, and they were there for good reasons. It's not surprising that if you say, I mean, after all, if a policeman, a police officer, talks to a journalist and gives a journalist a story off the record and anonymously, they could be a whistleblower who's trying to tell you about corruption and it's absolutely necessary. Or they could just be giving the journalist an inside story in return for favourable coverage next time, in return for their story about how the case is going actually being told. During the time of what we call cash for honours in Britain, when Tony Blair was being accused of effectively selling peerages to the House of Lords and so on, a series of leaks came out of the police inquiry. Those leaks went to all kinds of journalism, all kinds of journalists in broadsheet newspapers as well as in tabloids. The net result was to make the police look pretty good as if they were doing their job. Now the question is, was that corrupt? If it wasn't corrupt, why is the person who does it because they would quite like to be taken for lunch in order to give stories, why is that corrupt? In other words, there are some really difficult lines here. Is the passage of money or favours the point at which we say that there's a cut-off line? I think there has to be a cut-off line. There probably will be that one. It is an absurdity that Amelia is under suspicion, but it's also strange that she didn't expect it. If she didn't, probably she did actually. She may well have expected it to happen. It was a completely understandable consequence of the way in which the phone hacking story was told, that actually anybody who was getting information by back channels from the police would actually become a suspect. It followed like night followed day.
No, you can't really. No, I understand. It's legally difficult. Let's take one last question.
Here we are.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, Karen.
My name is Dennis Redmond. I'm former bureau chief of Associated Press here, and I teach international media at the school at Perugia. And I wanted to supplement what Vincenzo Giulia said about the coziness factor of Italian media and politicians. I think to be complete, I think you have to say that RAI is owned or run by, let's say, by Parliament. Therefore, the state broadcaster gives a certain space to what politicians say every day. So there is what they call the political account every day, and so every politician gets his say depending on the size of his party. Similarly, there was a large party press which diminished, but the people from the party press, of course, go and ask what their party believes, and that is what is the lead in the newspaper. But more than that, I wanted to ask you, because it's very prevalent in Italy that we have interceptions of conversations that politicians have had with business people. And there's always a discussion here, well, does it happen here only in Italy, or does it happen only in other countries? Also in other countries. And so my question is, do you think that the way things are going regarding the hacking scandal, that you would ever see in Britain or in another country that you would know, the actual text of the interception of the conversations of politicians with businessmen, and then that ending up in a newspaper? And if not, why not? Obviously, I know a bit of the answer, but I think this needs to be explained to the Italian audience, which every day sees these texts in the media.
Okay, now that's a good question to end on, which is partly this sort of specific question about, if you like, transcription. But do you think the outcome of this whole phone hacking, Leveson thing will be a new era dawning of transparency, or do you think it's actually going to end up with people becoming more cautious and more secretive? To both of you. David. No, David, and then...
I think it's a really, really tricky question to... I mean, at one level you think, well, people who want to do secret deals, if they find that their mechanisms for doing secret deals aren't secret anymore, they'll find another one that is secret. So the cynic in you says they'll find another way of having these forms of communication. But there's another process, and it's the one I spoke about right at the beginning. We are looking at a 50-year process whereby more and more information, including stuff that was secret, is now ending up in the public domain with ordinary people. And the big question, it seems to me, that is actually being created, and this is why I go back to analytical journalism, but along with investigative journalism, is that actually the big problem is making sense of the amount of information now which is out there in under the consequence of the information revolution. Where is the information that matters and where is the information that doesn't? How do you analyse what's going on and find out what's true about it and what's merely a passing fad or becomes today's headlines but actually doesn't tell you what's going on underneath? And I think that's really the big thing. The question is, how does the next generation coming up deal with information abundance? Who is giving that information? Who is analysing that information? To which sources do you trust and which sources do you not trust? How do you get to pay for and encourage the better sources of information, etc., once you have distinguished them from the worst sources of information? These are the really, really big questions that the advanced democracies face in the information world, and I think they transcend maybe some of the more temporary questions that we tend to discuss.
And just to add on to that, the power of the importance of analytical journalism is also under threat by the constant deadlines of the rolling news. So journalists often don't have time to sit down and analyse it. They're just told to get the information out, get it out straight on the internet. Suddenly a once-a-day deadline seems like an impossible luxury. In terms of whether we're going to have a cautious, cowed and emasculated journalism, media now, I hope that if we do get this definition of public interest cut and dried and agreed, we'll actually end up with a stronger, braver, more robust journalism, because it will know what it can do and it will have the confidence to do it.
And Claudio, please.
Generally speaking, in Italy, as you know, newspapers don't pay, and publishers don't pay for information. We just maybe sometimes it can happen that we pay, or newspapers pay for a photo for something like this, but not for information. Maybe because we don't have money. I don't know. Maybe that's the reason why. But we publish a newspaper publishes a lot of interceptions. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they come from the police. They come from judges and so on. I don't know if it's something that it's right or not. I have some questions, but I don't have answers. I mean, for example, during the last days, some newspapers, La Repubblica, that was the most important ones, published the interception between Mr. Berlusconi and some girls. And I'm not so sure that this is so important to publish these kind of things now, because 10 months ago he was the head of the government. Is not the government. Yes, he's still the head of the most important party in the parliament, but it's not in the government. Maybe it's so important or not. I don't know. Maybe it's just a way to have the level of the tension on the politics very high. But it's something that it depends. If it is something important for the public or not. Every time you have to choose and to try to understand what is important or not for our audiences.
Great. Thanks very much, Claudia. It's been really helpful to have that kind of perspective. We're going to have to stop there because we've run out of time. But this story, as they say, will continue. Amelia and the rest will be beavering away on it, and the judge will also be beavering away. So this is going to go on for months, and there'll be lots more to come out. So perhaps we can come back again to Perugia next year and see where this turned out. A great thanks again to the translators who had to deal with a very complicated technical discussion. But it's been really, really worthwhile. And thank you all for coming, and thanks for the speakers for being here.